The year was 2020. The work of dismantling the Duquesne Steel Works was a slow, grinding process of erasing the past. But the past refused to be erased. A ground-penetrating radar survey of blast furnace number 4 had flagged an anomaly, a section of the fire brick lining thicker and denser than any schematic allowed. On the third day of the teardown, a demolition crew breached the wall. Inside was not steel and slag, but a meticulously constructed cavity. Within this industrial tomb lay the skeletal remains of 2 individuals, their bones commingled with the corroded metal of a police badge and 2 service weapons. At that moment, the case of Officer John Connor and Officer Michael McCoy, who vanished into the November fog of 1998, was violently reopened. To understand the tomb, you must first understand the life that preceded it. The shift began like any other on that cold, drizzly November night in 1998. Inside Patrol Car 54, the silence was comfortable, broken only by the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers and the crackle of the police radio. Officer John Connor was 28 years old, a rookie with less than 2 years on the force. He was meticulous, by the book, and still possessed of the belief that procedure and protocol were shields against the city's chaos. He was making notes in his logbook, the penmanship neat and precise, a testament to a man who believed in order. Beside him, Officer Michael McCoy was the embodiment of a veteran. At 45, with retirement a visible horizon, he was cynical but sharp, his gaze taking in the rain-slicked streets with an economy of movement that spoke of decades of experience. He wasn't logging notes. He was watching the city breathe, feeling its rhythms. In his hand, he held a Zippo lighter, a gift from his daughter. He would flick it open and closed, the metallic click a familiar sound, a small anchor to the world of family and future that awaited him beyond the job. They were a study in contrasts, the eager future of the department and its weary, respected past. Connor saw the law in black and white, a code to be enforced. McCoy saw the 1,000 shades of grey in between, the deals, the compromises, the human failings that never made it into an incident report. He had tried to mentor the kid, to warn him that not every stone needed to be turned over. Some of them, he'd said just a week prior, hide things that can't be unhidden. Their final patrol route took them toward the Monongahela River, into the industrial sector that was already a ghost of its former self. The hulking skeletons of the steel mills loomed in the dark, silent monuments to a bygone era. McCoy was halfway through a sandwich from a deli that had been there since his own rookie years. The taste of rye and mustard, the familiar weight of his service weapon on his hip. These were the mundane realities of a life about to be extinguished. At 22:47, Connor's voice, clear and professional, came over the radio. Dispatch, Car 54, taking a final pass through the Duquesne Steel Works access road. All quiet. It was a routine transmission, one of hundreds that night. But it would be their last. At 2300 hours, the dispatcher tried to raise them for a shift change check-in. The only reply was the soft hiss of static. She tried again at 23:05. The airwaves remained silent. Car 54 had vanished from the world. Detective Rick Judge stood before blast furnace number 4 as the demolition crew was ordered to stand down. He had been a rookie himself when McCoy and Connor vanished, and McCoy had been his training officer, the man who taught him how to see the city not as it was, but as it could be. The official story had always tasted like ash in his mouth, a convenient lie to close an inconvenient case. Now the truth, or at least its bones, had been exhumed. The air, thick with the dust of a century of industry, now carried the weight of a 22-year-old secret. The scene was sealed, and the methodical work of archaeology began, not for an ancient king, but for 2 of their own. The forensics team moved with a quiet, practiced intensity, their white suits a ghostly presence against the rust and grime of the furnace's interior. Every grain of dust, every fragment of brick, was a potential witness. The process was agonizingly slow, a painstaking reconstruction of a single moment of violence frozen in time. They worked under powerful lights that cut through the gloom, documenting the precise location of each bone, each corroded piece of equipment that had once been a lifeline. The inventory of the tomb was a testament to a life interrupted. Item 1. A police badge, number 6150, belonging to Michael McCoy. Item 2. A portable radio, its casing crushed beyond repair. Item 3. 2 Glock service weapons, serial numbers checked and confirmed. And then, an object that didn't belong to the uniform, but to the man. A single Zippo lighter, nestled near the remains of McCoy's hand, a gift from his daughter, miraculously preserved in the dry, sealed environment. The initial report from the ballistics lab landed on Detective Judge's desk 48 hours later, and it didn't just challenge the old narrative, it obliterated it. Officer McCoy's weapon had been discharged one time. The bullet was not found in the tomb, nor in either of the skeletons. Officer Connor's remains, however, told a different story. Lodged within his thoracic vertebrae was a slug from a .357 Magnum. It was not police issue. The findings presented a cascade of new, urgent questions. The first was simple. Who had access to a blast furnace and the industrial know-how to seal it without a trace? The second was more specific. Who carried a .357 Magnum and had a reason to use it on a police officer? And the third was the most chilling. Where did McCoy's single desperate shot go? This was not a panicked burial. The careful brickwork, the use of industrial materials, the choice of a location designed to withstand immense heat and pressure, it all pointed to a single terrifying conclusion. This was not a crime of passion. It was a meticulously planned operation. The concealment of the bodies had been an act of industrial-scale engineering designed to last an eternity. The killers hadn't just hidden their victims, they had tried to erase them from history itself. To understand the discovery in 2020, one must first confront the failure of 1998. The initial investigation began with a frantic, wide-scale search. The patrol car, sitting silent by the Monongahela River, was an enigma. Keys in the ignition, a half-eaten sandwich on the dash. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no shattered glass. It was as if the two officers had simply evaporated into the damp night air. For days, dive teams combed the murky depths of the river. K-9 units scoured miles of desolate industrial wasteland. The search was exhaustive, professional, and utterly fruitless. In the vacuum of evidence, a narrative began to form, not from facts, but from whispers within the department itself. Michael McCoy, the cynical veteran, became the focal point. He knew the streets, the whispers said. He knew the players. Perhaps he had finally decided to leverage that knowledge for a score. The rookie, Connor, was painted as an unfortunate tag-along, either a reluctant accomplice or a victim of his partner's greed. The theory was ugly, unsubstantiated, but it was simple. And for a department facing a public relations nightmare, two of its own vanishing without a trace, it was convenient. Detective Judge, reviewing the yellowed case files decades later, saw the exact moment the investigation turned. A junior detective had noted that the officer's last known position was adjacent to the sprawling scrap metal empire owned by Vernon Wells, a celebrated titan of local industry. An interview with Wells and a review of his site's security logs was scheduled. But the interview never happened. A subsequent entry, in a different handwriting, simply states, "Directive from the Deputy Chief's Office. Line of inquiry regarding local business operations to be discontinued. Focus remains on potential internal misconduct." Vernon Wells, in 1998, was more than a businessman. He was a philanthropist, a political donor, a man whose name adorned university buildings and hospital wings. He was a pillar of the community, seemingly beyond reproach. The pressure to look away from such a man would have been immense, a quiet but unyielding force exerted through phone calls and closed-door meetings. The investigation was not just stymied, it was steered. The official theory hardened into accepted fact. The case of Officers Connor and McCoy became a cautionary tale, a stain on the department's honor. It was filed away, a cold case that no one was eager to reopen. The silence that fell over the investigation was not a passive consequence of a lack of leads. It was an active, deliberate construction. It was a wall, built not of brick and fireclay, but of institutional convenience, of fear, and of a shared, unspoken decision to sacrifice the reputations of two men in order to avoid confronting a far more powerful and unsettling truth. With the physical evidence from the tomb secured, Detective Judge's cold case unit turned its attention to the most unreliable of all records: human memory. The team compiled a list of every employee who had worked at the Duquesne Steel Works and Vernon Wells's adjacent scrap metal operation in the winter of 1998. Most were dead. Others had moved away, their trails cold for decades. But a handful remained, their names gathering dust in old Union records and city directories. They were the ghosts of the industrial age, and Judge intended to make them speak. The interviews were a study in futility and fear. A former night watchman, now in his late 70s and living in a small apartment overlooking the very river that was supposed to hold the officers' bodies, remembered the night only in fragments. He recalled seeing Vernon Wells's Lincoln town car leaving the site well after midnight, which wasn't unusual. But he remembered the look on Wells's face under the harsh sodium lights of the gate. Not angry, not worried, just cold. Like a man who'd just finished a long, hard day's work, the watchman said, his voice barely a whisper. He could offer nothing more. The name Vernon Wells, even after 22 years, still had the power to chill a room and shorten a man's memory. The team tracked down other names, other former employees. A secretary from Wells's company recalled shredding a month's worth of vehicle access logs for the scrapyard, an order that came directly from Wells the week after the officers disappeared. At the time, she assumed it was routine. Now she wasn't so sure. Each interview was the same. A small, unsettling detail wrapped in a thick blanket of fear and the fog of time. No one saw anything definitive. No one could place Connor and McCoy at the scrapyard. It was a wall of whispers, as impenetrable as the one inside the furnace. The most promising lead seemed to be the furnace foreman on duty that night, a man named Frank Kowalski. Records showed he led the shift responsible for blast furnace number 4, but the trail ended at a state-run nursing home east of the city. Detective Judge found Kowalski in a wheelchair, staring out a window at a barren courtyard. The man was a shell, ravaged by age and a profound, deep-seated trauma that had locked him inside himself. He was non-verbal, his eyes vacant. He didn't react to the names of Connor or McCoy. He didn't even flinch at the name Vernon Wells. To the investigation, Frank Kowalski was a dead end, a silent keeper of a secret his mind had long since buried. While witnesses provided only shadows, the archives offered a chance at substance. Judge's team secured a court order for the complete operational records of the Duquesne Steel Works, which had been archived by a local historical preservation society. They began the mind-numbing task of sifting through thousands of pages of maintenance logs, temperature readings, and shift reports, looking for a single anomaly on a single night more than 2 decades ago. For weeks, they found nothing. Then, a junior detective, fueled by coffee and obsession, found it. A logbook entry for blast furnace number 4 dated the day of the disappearance. The furnace had been scheduled for a cold shutdown, a complete cooling for a planned relining of its fire brick walls. But a handwritten entry, logged at 23:30 hours, countermanded that order. It authorized a 3-man crew, led by Foreman Frank Kowalski, to conduct an emergency, high-temperature refractory patch on the interior wall. The work order attached was even more telling. It detailed the use of a specific, pre-mixed batch of industrial fire clay, enough to seal a cavity of approximately 6 cubic meters. And the authorization signature at the bottom did not belong to a steel works plant manager. It belonged to Vernon Wells, who had invoked a clause in his land lease agreement allowing him emergency access to site equipment for urgent structural maintenance. There was no report of any damage that would require such a patch. The furnace hadn't been broken. It was being repurposed. The investigation now had two powerful, tangible leads: Vernon Wells's signature on the furnace work order and the non-police issue .357 Magnum slug recovered from John Connor's spine. Detective Judge's team began digging into Wells's background. They found he was a registered firearms enthusiast and a charter member of an exclusive gun club in the 1990s, a club known for favoring powerful handguns, including custom-loaded .357 Magnums. The connection was almost too perfect, a straight line pointing directly at their prime suspect. And then the past reached out to muddy the waters. An anonymous tip was called in, not to the police, but to a veteran crime reporter at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. The caller, his voice electronically disguised, claimed to have been a low-level player in the city's organized crime scene back in the 90s. He said the story of the missing cops was simple. McCoy was dirty, taking kickbacks from a notorious mob figure named Giuseppe "Joe the Fixer" Moretti. Moretti was a rival of Wells, trying to muscle in on his territory. The officers were caught in the middle of a turf war meeting that went bad. Moretti, the tipster claimed, was a man who preferred to solve his problems with a .357 Magnum. The theory landed like a bombshell. It aligned perfectly with the old, poisonous rumors from the original investigation. Suddenly, the department's institutional memory was reawakened. Old-timers who had worked the case nodded knowingly. The mob angle felt right. It felt familiar. It explained McCoy's alleged corruption and the brutal professional nature of the disposal. Moretti was long dead, having succumbed to cancer years ago, making him the perfect posthumous villain. Under immense pressure from his superiors and the media, Judge had no choice but to divert resources and pursue this seemingly credible lead. For weeks, the cold case unit found itself chasing a ghost. They dove into decades-old organized crime files, interviewing retired FBI agents and mob informants who were now old men living in quiet suburbs. They painstakingly reconstructed Moretti's criminal empire, a violent enterprise of extortion and smuggling that did indeed operate in the shadow of the city's dying steel industry. They even found records confirming Moretti owned several .357 revolvers. The false trail was becoming more and more convincing, a compelling narrative that threatened to become the new, official truth. The theory collapsed not with a bang, but with a quiet click of a keyboard. A junior analyst, tasked with building a definitive timeline of Moretti's life, cross-referenced his criminal file with Federal Bureau of Prisons medical records. The discovery was irrefutable. In November of 1998, Giuseppe Moretti was not on the streets of Pittsburgh. For the entirety of that year, he had been an inmate in the secure medical ward of a federal penitentiary in Minnesota, in the final, debilitating stages of terminal lung cancer. He was bedridden, under 24-hour guard, and physically incapable of holding a glass of water, let alone a handgun. He could not have been the killer. The tip was not a clue. It was a deliberate and calculated act of misdirection. The collapse of the Moretti theory left a ringing silence in the investigation. The deliberate misdirection, however, had the opposite of its intended effect. It proved to Detective Judge that the killer was not only still alive, but was actively watching the investigation and was afraid. There was now only one name left on the list, a name that connected the furnace, the suspicious work order, and the rare ammunition type: Vernon Wells. The investigation was no longer a search for a ghost. It was a siege, slowly tightening its circle around a celebrated titan of industry. But the circle was incomplete. Judge had powerful circumstantial evidence, but he lacked the final, irrefutable link. In a move born of equal parts desperation and instinct, Judge decided to make one final visit to the state-run nursing home. He signed out a single piece of evidence from the lab, item number 7, the Zippo lighter that had belonged to Michael McCoy. He drove east. the small evidence bag resting on the passenger seat, a relic from a world of loyalty and violence. He found Frank Kowalski in the same chair, in the same room, his gaze lost in the same empty courtyard. The nurses warned him it was pointless. The man hadn't spoken a coherent sentence in years. Judge knelt in front of the old man, the worn linoleum cool against his knee. He said nothing. He simply opened the evidence bag and placed the Zippo in Kowalski's limp, wrinkled hand. For a moment, there was no reaction. Then, Kowalski's thumb, guided by a muscle memory buried for 22 years, found the lid. He flicked it open. The sharp metallic click echoed in the quiet room, a sound that had been silenced for over 2 decades. Kowalski's vacant eyes suddenly focused. A tremor ran through his frail body. A single tear traced a path through the weathered lines of his face. He always did that, Kowalski whispered, his voice a dry, rasping sound of pure disuse. Click, 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 drove the rookie crazy. Detective Judge froze, then subtly activated the audio recorder on his phone. The dam of trauma, sealed for a lifetime, had been breached by a single, familiar sound. The story, once it started, came out in a torrent of fragmented, horrifying images. It wasn't a mob deal. It was simpler, and for that reason, more brutal. Officer Connor, the diligent rookie, had stumbled upon the true nature of Vernon Wells's business. The scrapyard wasn't just for metal. It was one of the largest, most sophisticated chop shop operations on the East Coast, disassembling stolen luxury cars for overseas shipment. Connor had found the evidence, and true to his by-the-book nature, he intended to act on it. McCoy, the veteran, had tried to pull him back, to de-escalate, but it was too late. They confronted Wells in his office. Kowalski, his voice growing stronger with each resurrected detail, described the final moments. Wells, realizing he was cornered, didn't panic. He simply opened his desk drawer and produced a silver point .357 Magnum revolver. He shot Connor once, without hesitation. McCoy, reacting with pure instinct, drew his weapon and fired a single shot that went wide, embedding itself in the wall as he was tackled by Wells's men. McCoy was subdued and then executed. Every disparate fact, the non-police slug, McCoy's one missing bullet, the urgency to dispose of the bodies, now snapped into a single brutal timeline confessed by the last living witness. Based on Frank Kowalski's confession, a confession corroborated by every piece of physical evidence, the final hour of Officers Connor and McCoy can now be reconstructed. It began not with a deal gone wrong, but with a rookie doing his job too well. Officer John Connor had found something in the labyrinthine grounds of the scrapyard, a discrepancy, a vehicle identification number that didn't belong, a thread that, if pulled, would unravel Vernon Wells's entire criminal enterprise. He logged it and, following protocol, decided to ask the owner directly. McCoy, sensing the danger, tried to wave him off, but Connor's diligence was absolute. They entered the main office, a small island of order in a sea of industrial decay. The confrontation was not loud or aggressive. It was quiet, professional. Connor, clipboard in hand, presented his findings to Vernon Wells. For Wells, a man who had built an empire on calculated risks, this was the one variable he could not control. A police officer who couldn't be bought, bribed, or intimidated. He saw not a routine inquiry, but the complete and total ruin of his life. His response was immediate and final. From his desk drawer, Wells produced the silver point .357 Magnum. The sound of the shot was a deafening crack, a sound of absolute finality that echoed off the cinder-block walls. Officer Connor's clipboard clattered to the floor, its papers scattering. He fell not like a man, but like a puppet whose strings had been abruptly cut, his last act of perfect record-keeping undone in a single, violent second. Reacting on pure instinct, McCoy drew his service weapon, A second, sharper report answered the first as he fired a single shot in defense. A plume of plaster dust erupted from the wall behind Wells's desk. Before a second shot could be fired, Wells's men, waiting in the wings, converged on McCoy. The struggle was short, brutal, and utterly one-sided. He was disarmed and forced to the ground. The threat was not just neutralized, it was contained. Wells, calm and in command, surveyed the scene. In his mind, the problem was not the two officers, one dead and one subdued, but the logistics of their permanent disappearance. His eyes fell upon the silent, hulking form of Blast Furnace No. 4, visible through his office window. It was the perfect, ready-made tomb. This is where Foreman Frank Kowalski and his crew entered the nightmare. They were summoned not to witness a crime, but to receive a work order. The bodies of the two officers were now a silent, undeniable instruction. Wells didn't need to shout or threaten. He simply explained the task, his tone that of a manager discussing an urgent repair. He made it clear that their silence and their cooperation were linked directly to the well-being of their families. The choice they were given was not a choice at all. Under the cold glare of industrial floodlights, the three furnace workers began their grim task. They were skilled men, experts in brickwork and refractory materials. Now, their life's trade was being used to entomb two public servants. With practiced efficiency, they opened a cavity in the furnace wall, placed the bodies and their equipment inside, and then began the slow, methodical process of sealing them in. Each scrape of the trowel, each perfectly placed fire brick, was another layer of silence, another guarantee that the secret would be kept. By dawn, the work was done. The patch was seamless, indistinguishable from the rest of the furnace wall, a masterpiece of industrial concealment. Frank Kowalski's videotaped confession was the legal and moral fulcrum the case had lacked for 22 years. Corroborated by the forensic evidence, it was an unimpeachable account of the crime. Armed with an arrest warrant for 2 counts of first-degree murder, Detective Rick Judge did not delegate the final act. At dawn the next day, a convoy of unmarked sedans and patrol cars, their lights off, moved with silent, coordinated purpose through the gates of Vernon Wells's lavish estate in Sewickley Heights. The 80-year-old titan of industry, the celebrated philanthropist, was awake. It is believed he was alerted to the approaching police presence by his own sophisticated security system. He did not attempt to flee. He did not make any calls. As the tactical team breached the heavy oak doors of the front entrance, a single muffled gunshot echoed from a second-floor study. They found him in his leather chair, overlooking the manicured grounds his criminal enterprise had paid for. Beside his hand, on the polished mahogany desk, lay a Silver Point .357 Magnum revolver, the same model that had ended John Connor's life. The news of Wells's crimes and suicide sent a shockwave through Pittsburgh. The city that had once celebrated his generosity was now forced to confront the brutal foundation upon which it was built. Posthumously, his empire was dismantled, his name stripped from buildings and charity boards, his legacy reduced to a single, monstrous act of self-preservation. For his surviving accomplices, now old and infirm, justice was a quiet affair of plea bargains and sworn depositions, their testimony cementing the final, ugly truth. For the families of John Connor and Michael McCoy, the news was not a victory, but a bitter, long overdue vindication. For 2 decades, they had lived not only with the grief of their loss, but with the institutional stain on the names of their loved ones. The truth, when it finally arrived, was a cold comfort. It restored honor, but it could not restore life. The legal chapter of the disappearance of Car 54 was closed. A guilty man was exposed, and the names of 2 honorable police officers were officially cleared. But for those who had lived in the shadow of that lie for more than 2 decades, the verdict of history could not heal the wounds inflicted by years of silence and suspicion. Legal justice, it turned out, was a blunt instrument, incapable of repairing the delicate architecture of a stolen life. The demolition of the Duquesne Steel Works was permanently halted. Today, Blast Furnace No. 4 stands not as a relic of industry, but as a monument to a secret it was forced to keep. The structure has been declared a city landmark. Where the demolition crew breached the wall, there is now a simple, unadorned bronze plaque. It bears the names of Officer John Connor and Officer Michael McCoy, their ranks, and 2 dates: the day they vanished and the day they were found. The rust-streaked steel that surrounds it stands as a silent, eternal witness. Inside the lobby of the Pittsburgh Police Headquarters, 2 objects rest in a climate-controlled glass case. One is a police badge, number 6150, its silver surface painstakingly restored. Beside it sits a Zippo lighter, its brass casing showing the wear of 1,000 absent-minded clicks. They are no longer just a man's possessions, they are artifacts. They are a permanent, institutional reminder that the truth, no matter how deep it is buried, can be exhumed, and that a good man's name, no matter how long it is tarnished, can be polished clean again. The city of Pittsburgh was forged in fire and steel. Its history is written in the language of industry, of hard labor, and the immense power required to bend metal to human will. For 22 years, that same power was used to conceal a brutal crime, to entomb 2 men in the very foundation of the city's identity. The story of Connor and McCoy became a dark footnote in that history, a cautionary tale of how the machinery of power can be used not only to build, but to bury. The great mills along the Monongahela River have been silent for a generation. The roar of the furnaces and the clang of steel on steel have been replaced by the whisper of the wind through skeletal gantries. But if you stand at the foot of Blast Furnace No. 4, you will find that the silence there is different. It is not empty. It has weight.